Kingston, Jamaica, July 21st, 1979. 60,000 people screaming Bob Marley's name. The music was perfect. The energy was electric. And then, a man died. Right there. Section 23, row 15, seat 7. His heart stopped beating. Paramedics said there was nothing they could do. 5 minutes without oxygen. Brain death imminent. But what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Not the doctors, not the crowd, not even Bob Marley himself. Because sometimes, music doesn't just touch your soul. Sometimes it literally restarts your heart. The first drum hit sounded like thunder rolling through National Stadium. Bob Marley and the Wailers had just finished Is This Love? And the crowd was in absolute ecstasy. People were dancing, singing, crying with joy. The air was thick with humidity, anticipation, and something else. Something spiritual that you could almost reach out and touch. This wasn't just a concert. This was communion. Bob Marley wasn't just a musician to these people. He was a prophet, a healer, the voice of those who had been silenced for generations. The band began the opening notes of One Love, arguably Bob's most iconic anthem of unity and hope. The crowd swayed in unison, thousands of voices joining together in perfect harmony. It was beautiful. It was transcendent. But something was terribly wrong. In section 23, row 15, seat 7, a 47-year-old man named Marcus Thompson suddenly felt a sharp, crushing pain in his chest. His daughter Sarah, standing next to him, noticed her father's face change. The joy drained from his expression, replaced by confusion, then fear. "Dad?" Sarah grabbed his arm. "Dad, are you okay?" Marcus tried to speak but couldn't. His hand went to his chest, clutching at his shirt. His breathing became rapid and shallow. And then, before Sarah could even scream for help, Marcus collapsed. The people around them immediately noticed. Hands reached out to catch him as he fell. Someone shouted for a doctor. Another person ran to find security. Within seconds, a small circle had formed around Marcus's unconscious body while the rest of the stadium continued celebrating, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding in their midst. Sarah dropped to her knees beside her father, tears already streaming down her face. "Help! Somebody help! My father isn't breathing!" A man who identified himself as a nurse pushed through the crowd. He checked Marcus's pulse and his face went pale. "He's in cardiac arrest," he said urgently. "Someone get the paramedics. Now." But here's what nobody knew yet. Here's the part that would make this night unforgettable. Bob Marley, on stage, hundreds of feet away, surrounded by amplified music and thousands of screaming fans, somehow sensed that something was wrong. Carlton Barrett, Bob's drummer, later described what happened. Bob was singing One Love, and suddenly he just stopped mid-verse. His eyes were scanning the crowd like he was looking for something specific. We thought maybe there was a security issue or someone rushing the stage. But Bob's face, he looked concerned, worried, like he could feel something the rest of us couldn't. Bob held up his hand, signaling the band to lower the volume. The music didn't stop completely, but it quieted enough that Bob could speak. "Wait," Bob said into the microphone, his voice cutting through the stadium. "Something is not right." 60,000 people went from celebration to confusion in seconds. What was happening? Was the concert being stopped? Bob walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes still scanning the crowd. "Someone needs help," he said, though he couldn't possibly have known where or who. "I can feel it. Someone in Jaw's children needs help right now." The stadium fell into an eerie, near silence. People stopped dancing. They stopped singing. They looked around, trying to understand what Bob was sensing. And then someone in Section 23 began waving their arms frantically, trying to get attention. Then another person. Then another. A wave of movement drew everyone's eyes to that area of the stadium. Security personnel with radios began converging on Section 23. The stadium's medical team was already on their way, but Bob wasn't satisfied to just watch from the stage. He did something that concert managers and security teams would later call completely unprecedented and frankly dangerous. Bob Marley walked off the stage, not backstage, not to his dressing room. He walked down into the crowd. His security team scrambled to follow him. His band stood frozen, unsure whether to keep playing or stop. The audience created a path for him as he moved through them with purpose, heading directly towards Section 23. By the time Bob reached Marcus, the paramedics had arrived. They had begun CPR, but Marcus wasn't responding. One paramedic was doing chest compressions. Another was preparing a defibrillator. Sarah was being held back by concerned concertgoers, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her father die in front of her. "How long has he been down?" one of the paramedics asked. "Nearly 4 minutes," the nurse who had first assessed Marcus replied. "No pulse, no breathing. I think he's gone." 4 minutes without oxygen to the brain. Medical professionals know what that means. Brain damage becomes likely after 3 to 4 minutes. After 5 minutes, it becomes almost certain. Bob Marley pushed through the small crowd that had formed around Marcus. Security tried to stop him, worried for his safety, but Bob waved them off. "Let me through," Bob said quietly but firmly. "Please." When Sarah saw Bob Marley approaching, her grief mixed with disbelief. This couldn't be real. Bob Marley was coming to her father. Bob knelt beside Marcus's body. The paramedics were still working, still trying, but their faces showed what they weren't saying out loud. They were losing this fight. "How is he?" Bob asked. One of the paramedics looked at Bob, recognized him immediately, and shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marley. We're doing everything we can, but he's been without a pulse for nearly 5 minutes now." Bob looked at Marcus's face. A stranger. Someone he'd never met. A man who had come to hear him sing and was now dying instead. "What's his name?" Bob asked Sarah. "Marcus," Sarah managed to say through her tears. "Marcus Thompson. He's my father." Bob nodded slowly. Then he did something that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. He leaned down close to Marcus's ear and began to sing. Not loudly, not for the audience, just for Marcus. "One love, one heart. Let's get together and feel all right." The paramedics continued their work, but even they paused momentarily, struck by the surreal beauty of the moment. Bob Marley, one of the most famous musicians in the world, singing to a dying man in the middle of a stadium. Bob's voice was soft but clear, intimate despite the chaos around them. "Hear the children crying, one love. Hear the children crying, one heart." He sang the entire verse directly into Marcus's ear, his hand resting gently on the man's chest. And then something happened that the paramedics would later document in their report as medically anomalous. Marcus's body jerked. His eyes flew open. He gasped, a desperate, drowning man gasp, and air flooded into his lungs. The paramedic doing chest compressions stopped, stunned. "I've got a pulse," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "I've got a pulse. It's weak, but it's there." Sarah screamed, not in grief this time, but in hope. "Dad! Dad!" Marcus's eyes were unfocused, confused. He was alive, but barely conscious. The paramedics immediately went back to work, stabilizing him, preparing to transport him to the hospital. But before they took him away, Marcus's eyes found Bob's face. For just a moment, the two men looked at each other. Marcus's lips moved, trying to form words. Bob leaned in closer to hear. "Thank you," Marcus whispered. "I heard you. In the darkness, I heard you singing." Bob's eyes filled with tears. He squeezed Marcus's hand. "You're going to be all right, brother. Jaw isn't finished with you yet." The paramedics lifted Marcus onto a stretcher and began carrying him out of the stadium. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, erupted in applause. Not the wild, celebratory applause of a concert, but the emotional, tearful applause of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Sarah grabbed Bob's hand before he could leave. "You saved him," she said, crying. "You brought my father back." Bob shook his head gently. "I just sang him a song, sister. Jah did the rest." Bob returned to the stage, and when he picked up his microphone again, 60,000 people gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. But Bob wasn't interested in applause. He was shaken, moved, changed by what had just happened. "Music is more than sound," Bob said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "Music is life itself. When we sing together, when we feel together, we're reminding each other why we're here. We're reminding each other to stay alive." He started playing One Love again from the beginning. But this time, when he sang it, everyone in that stadium understood that these weren't just lyrics. They were truth. They were medicine. They were magic. Marcus Thompson spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors who examined him were baffled. He had been clinically dead for nearly 5 minutes. His heart had completely stopped. By every medical standard, he should have suffered severe brain damage if he survived at all. But Marcus showed no signs of neurological impairment. His heart, after the initial trauma, began functioning normally. Within a week, he was home with his family. Dr. James Mitchell, the cardiologist who treated Marcus, later gave an interview to the Jamaica Gleaner. "I've been practicing cardiology for 30 years. I've seen hundreds of cardiac arrest cases. What happened to Marcus Thompson doesn't fit any medical pattern I know. The length of time he was without oxygen should have caused catastrophic brain damage. But his neurological tests were completely normal. I can't explain it." But Sarah could explain it. At least she had her own explanation. "My father was dying," she told the newspaper 2 weeks after the concert. "He was gone, and Bob Marley brought him back. Not with medicine, not with machines, with music, with love. I know how that sounds. I know people will say it was just coincidence, just good timing with the paramedics. But I was there. I saw my father's face. He was dead. And then Bob sang to him, and he came back." Marcus himself was reluctant to call it a miracle, but he couldn't deny what he experienced. "I remember the pain in my chest," Marcus said in the same interview. "I remember falling, and then darkness, complete darkness. I felt like I was sinking, moving away from everything. I could hear voices, but they were distant, like they were on the other side of a wall. I felt scared. I felt alone." He paused, his eyes distant with the memory. "But then I heard singing. Bob's voice. I can't explain how, because I know I was unconscious. I know my heart had stopped. But I heard him. And his voice was like a rope in the darkness. Something I could hold on to. Something that showed me the way back." The story spread quickly through Jamaica and then around the world. Bob Marley saves fans' life during concert. Reggae star's song brings dead man back to life. Music as medicine, the Marcus Thompson miracle. Some people dismissed it as coincidence, the result of skilled paramedics and fortunate timing. Others saw it as proof of music's healing power, or of Bob Marley's spiritual gift. But what most people don't know is what happened in the months after that night. Bob Marley visited Marcus at his home, not for publicity, not for media. He just showed up one afternoon with his guitar, wanting to check on the man whose life had intersected with his in such an extraordinary way. They talked for hours. Marcus told Bob about his life, his childhood in rural Jamaica, his struggles to provide for his family, his love for music that had brought him to that concert. Bob shared his own stories, his own fears, his own questions about life and death and purpose. "You know what scared me most that night?" Bob told Marcus. "I didn't know if I could help you. I just felt like I had to try. Music is all I have to give, so I gave it." Marcus smiled. It was enough. Before Bob left, he did something that Marcus would treasure for the rest of his life. He wrote a song right there in Marcus's small living room. Bob composed a piece of music dedicated to the man who had died and come back. The song was never commercially released. Bob never performed it in public, but he recorded it on Marcus's tape recorder, and that recording became Marcus's most precious possession. The song was called "Brother's Breath," and its lyrics were simple but profound. "When the darkness calls your name and your heart forgets its flame, listen for the music near love will find you. Have no fear." 2 years later, in 1981, Bob Marley died of cancer. He was only 36 years old. Marcus attended the funeral, holding Sarah's hand, both of them crying for the man who had given Marcus a second chance at life. But the story didn't end there. Marcus Thompson lived for another 38 years after that night. He spent those years teaching CPR and cardiac health awareness across Jamaica, sharing his story not as a miracle, but as a reminder that compassion and quick action save lives. His daughter Sarah became an emergency room doctor, inspired by the paramedics and by Bob's compassionate response. In 2005, she opened the Marcus Thompson Cardiac Center in Kingston, providing free heart care to underserved communities. Above the entrance is a quote from Bob Marley: "One love, one heart." Marcus died peacefully in 2017 at the age of 86, surrounded by his family, including grandchildren and great-grandchildren who wouldn't exist without those 7 minutes when Bob Marley sang him back to life. At Marcus's funeral, Sarah played the recording of "Brother's Breath" for the first time publicly. Many had never heard it before. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Years later, researchers studying music therapy cited the Marcus Thompson case as evidence that music, particularly reggae's specific rhythms, can have measurable effects on heart function. Today, cardiac rehabilitation programs around the world use carefully curated playlists to support healing. And on those playlists, almost always, you'll find Bob Marley's "One Love." The story of Bob Marley and Marcus Thompson reminds us that music isn't just entertainment. It's medicine.